I know it's going really fast, but it's going to go quickly, not this quickly. But today we're going to make this super simple little beginner patchwork sampler. Start by ironing your fabrics out, and then we are going to cut using the little pattern that I have printed out over here. This is a great one if you're just starting patchwork. It's going to teach you about a couple of different sizes of piecing, and if you want to screenshot this, you can see what I'm making today. But we have two larger patches that are going to go opposite each other, and they are 5.5 inches square. And then we are going to make a few little patchwork pieces. So this is great for using up scraps. Like I said, if you have scraps that you want to just use and make a couple of little mug rugs, or this could be just a really cute thing for underneath of like potted plants or something if you set those around, just little drip catchers or little hot plates underneath of your bowls and things like that. So we're going to start by squaring up our fabric. For this one, I need I need four 3-inch squares and two 3 by 5.5 inch rectangles, and then those two 5-inch squares. So I'm just cutting them from an assortment of fabrics that I like that go together. Again, you can choose anything that you like from your stash, or if you wanted to make this and you didn't have a stash, I would go get maybe 3 or 4 different fat quarters or fat eighths even that go together that you like the combination. I usually use a large print as a jumping off point that maybe has all of my colors in it, and you can see that floral up there at the top. Here it is. It has that buttery yellow, it has the blue, and then I use some smaller prints in geometrics. That's what I like to do. And here I'm just lining it up on my grid and trimming to the correct sizes as indicated by my pattern. Pretty easy peasy lemon squeezy. So there I cut off two of the 3-inch squares that are going to go there in that little block I'm going to make. And I like to put them diagonal one another. There is my 3 by 5.5 inch strip for the top section. And I'm going to put a couple of those florals again in diagonally from one another and also diagonally from my top piece of floral. Then I have this small darker blue geometric. I think it has like a very repetitive geometric floral, and that is a 5.5 inch block. And then I have a dark 5.5 inch block with that cute little grid. And then I have this golden buttery yellow, nice open geometric to finish off my pattern. And then it's simply putting those two patchwork sections together and sewing them onto the larger 5.5 inch blocks to complete. So I'm placing those 3 by 5.5 inch rectangles right sides together, and I'm sewing a 1/4 inch down that side. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my 3-inch blocks. So I'm going to sew down that side by putting right sides together, and by rotating which direction they lay, I will very easily be able to open those up and continue to piece them together. And then I am taking that top block there where I just put the two strips together, and I'm sewing it to its 5.5 inch block to complete my top row. Then these little 3-inch patchworks, I'm pressing the seam open and I'm going to nest those seams. So I've pressed them, and I'm using that little ridge created by the seam press to lock that seam together right there. See how they nest together? And then I'm going to sew right along that side to finish my 4 square patch. So here is my top row and then my 4 square patch. And I'm just going to finger press that, and then I'm going to sew it to its corresponding 5.5 inch block. So those 3-inch squares, when you put them all together, because you're doing that 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to end up with a 5.5 inch block. And that's the quilt math there. And I am just going to press the seams open. I prefer to press seams open when the things are going to head different directions. And then I'm going to line up my center seam by putting my top row and my bottom row, and I'm just making sure that those center seams align really well. And I am going to pin. I like to put my pin further back so I don't have to worry about sewing over it or removing it when I am sewing, but that just keeps everything from shifting. And then it's just adding this center seam to connect our top and bottom rows. Removing my pin, I'm going to open it up and go give it a nice hot press. And here you can see how I did to create my pattern. Very nice. It makes a 10-inch square. So I'm laying it on my grid ruler, my grid mat ruler, and I'm just going to line up the center seam with the center line on my mat so that it's nice and even. And I'm just double checking that I have 5 inches on either side of that seam, and then I'm just going to trim off anything that overhangs. So you can see there's like a little bit of shifting in the fabric that happened. I'm just going to cut that away to square it up nice and perfectly. And I'm going around every edge and doing that squaring up. And just neatens the whole thing. And if you have these grid mats, it makes it super simple to do this. And then I'm just going to sweep everything up. And it is time to cut our batting. So you just need a small piece of batting for this. Again, it's just 10 inches. I like to leave about an inch around the outside so that, again, if it shifts while you're quilting, you can just trim that away and neaten everything up. So I'm just going to line up my grid ruler about and cut an inch away from my center block. And then once I've done that, I'm just going to sort of recenter it, and then I'm going to choose a backing fabric. So I have a little bit more of this golden fabric here with the sort of crosshatch and dot print. I really like that. It's a really pretty color. Um, and I am going to lay my trimmed batting and my block on top of it. And I think I'm lining it up with the edge that is slightly off screen. I apologize. But I would line it up against an edge, and then I'm just going to trim away the excess fabric. And here I'm not really measuring. You could take it off and cut it, but I'm just laying my block on top. And since I have that 1-inch border around the outside, I know that I'll have a little 1-inch border of the backing fabric as well. And then, like I said, once I've completed my quilting, I will trim all of that, anything away that is on the outside of my block. Now, before I start quilting, I am going to make myself a few grid lines to quilt on, and I have a Hera marker here. You're going to see that. It is like a bone folder if you're familiar with that. It's a little plastic, or you can get them wooden tools. And when you use your ruler and press into it, it makes a little depression in the fabric that you can see, so you know where to sew along without having to mark your fabric. And then obviously you don't have to like clean it off or worry if it wipes away or anything. You simply are just going to sew right along that like very slight little dimple that it creates in the fabric, and that helps you know where you're going to quilt. So then I would pin it a little bit. Actually, I'm not sure if I pinned here. Sometimes when I'm doing really small projects, I don't really bother to pin because they don't shift that much. There's not a lot of weight. They're not going to move around that much. They mostly fit on the top of my sewing machine here. So I'm not totally worried about that, but you could also pin this or spray base if you prefer. And then I'm simply using the seam lines as well as that Hera marker grid that I created and sewing a really simple gridded quilting on the top of this. I think it's perfectly fine to have this be really simple. If you wanted to, this would be a great way to also practice creating really small, like what they call matchstick quilting, where you would quilt again and again and again really tightly together, maybe like an eighth of an inch or a quarter inch apart. I didn't really want to do that this day. I just wanted to keep it simple, so I did a very opened, I believe they're 2.5 inches apart, um, because I just followed the size of the smallest patchwork. And next I'm going to make my binding, and I need 2 strips that are 2.5 inches wide by the width of the fabric. So that was the binding color that I was going to use, is that green. And right now I'm just trimming up around the outside of my little quilted square. So again, I'm finding the lines, I'm lining up both with my center of my patchwork and as well as the grid ruler to make sure that I've got everything straight there. I usually line it up on my center line that's going through my patchwork, and then trim away anything that does not stay within the boundary, you know. So anything outside of that, so that it's nice and even and square. And you can see the nice quilting on the back. And now we're going to make our binding. So that is just a width of fabric and 2.5 inches. So again, I'm just lining it up on my grid ruler, and I'm going to use my ruler here. It has 2.5 inches. Slice it up, trim off anything that doesn't fit. Luckily, I was able to get 2 strips out of this. So that's probably like an eighth of fabric there. And then I'm trimming off the edges, which you can't see, the little selvage edges. Then we are going to take our trimmed binding fabric here and take it over to the sewing machine and create some continuous binding. So you're going to line those corners up perpendicular to one another, right sides together, and then sew on the diagonal. See how it's making a little diamond and we're sewing down through it? And that is going to create a continuous binding so that when you flip it over, you have that diagonal seam. You just cut off anything to the upper part of that, and it reduces the bulk rather than sewing them straight together where you have a really fat seam. And I'm taking it over to my iron and I'm folding it in half and pressing the raw edges and the wrong sides of the fabric together. And this makes a really nice binding strip where there's no raw edges that will be showing at the end of our project. Then I like to start on the back, and I'm lining up the raw edges, and I'm leaving myself a little tail, and you'll see why in a little bit here. And I simply use my foot, walking foot on my sewing machine, and I'm sewing down into one corner, and then I am going to miter these corners. So I'm flipping my binding up and I'm lining it up with the outside edge, making a little finger press to create that diagonal, and then I'm bringing it down straight and lining the other edge up with the top corner. And this creates a little pocket that then is on an angle, and when you roll it over itself, it's created a little mitered edge that's nice and clean. And you just sew down and you continue into the next corner. I typically back stitch just so I'm not pulling on it whenever I'm creating the miter, but here you go. You flip it up so it creates that little diagonal. See the diagonal there? And you're lining up those raw edges as you flip it up. Then you're rolling that down and lining up the raw edge heading in the downward direction. And see how you have that little pocket there? That is the miter. So I always pin that. And then when you put it back on your machine, you're going to start there. And I give a little back stitch just to secure everything. And then we are going to do a little continuous thing there like we have. I don't love that it lined up with where I had created my very first continuous strip, so That's not awesome, but I laid them over top of one another and created a small little notch in the fabric, and then I am using the width and I'm lining it up with that notch there to give me my measurement of how much tail I need to connect everything. So see how it didn't match up perfectly there? That's annoying. Um, Also, I didn't really leave myself enough room, so I recommend leaving a little bit longer of a piece to work with, but then you fold over the pieces and I'm lining up I'm putting them right sides together and I'm lining up the corner of the one piece of my strip right sides together, and I'm using that little notch to find where my square is to create that V again. So notice that it's creating a V. Right sides are together. I have the little edge of my um, patchwork folded over so I can work with it. It is a little tight. Like I said, I didn't leave quite enough room. I wish I had a little tail, but sometimes that's hard on these pieces. But I have it overlapped. I had to pull it apart because I didn't get a good start there. So make sure it's flat as you can get it. And you probably want to pin it together to create that little V, the same way that we did when we made the continuous binding. And I'll show you when I pop it off of the machine here. But I'm just sewing corner to corner. See how it's corner to corner? And I have that little V. And then when you flip it over, you're going to get that continuous binding again. And you trim off the excess, just like we did when we created the large binding strips. It does the same effect. And then you just use your fingers to lay that flat and continue sewing those raw edges lined up with the exterior raw edge of your patchwork, and then you'll have a completed piece with no bulky binding. And here comes the little pouch. See how there's a nice little bit of fabric, and then you fold it over each other. So you fold one side flat and straight, put a little pin in there so it can't wiggle about, and then you fold the other side down, and see how it has that nice miter, and you just line it up and put a pin in there as well. And we're going to do that to every corner. So fold it over, pin it, fold that guy over, pin it, just wiggle those corners until they line up nicely with one another, and it tucks all of your little raw bits away, and it looks so nice at the end. And then we're going to put that back on the sewing machine, and we're going to top sew the whole thing down. Now you can do this by hand, but I just prefer to top sew. So again, I'm just going pretty close to that edge, and I like to over sew in my corners just slightly. So I'm removing my pin and doing a couple of stitches going down, and then I back up and I go a little bit over. That just really secures the corner for use, so that the pocket, stays nice and secure. And as you sew down into the corner, you just remove the pin out of your way. Leave your needle down as you pivot your sewing machine. And back stitching there, and I'm just going forward, just tucking and rolling as I go. You could also do that and add a bunch of pins, but again, for such a small piece, I'm not really sure that's necessary. Just kind of go slowly and fold as you work. If it were a larger piece, even I usually don't do that. I usually only pin in the corners just because I hate removing pins as I sew. Sometimes I do use those clover clips along the edge, especially if I'm working with like Minky, which shifts a lot. But on something like this, I would just pin in those corners. And then coming to the end, we've gone the whole way around and we are all done. So here is my finished patchwork. Very cute, very simple. Just a little bit of fun scrappiness to get you started in your quilting. Again, if you'd like to take a little screenshot of the pattern and the finished project here, you can take all of those measurements. And here it is all done. Very cute. Thank you so much for joining me today, friends. I hope you felt inspired to get in your sewing room and use your scraps and make a really cute project. Here it is displayed with a few new items for my booth space, and it will be down there for sale.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a great day.